So, good afternoon, everyone. If you are in Europe and the UK, and good day, wherever you are in the world. We know we have colleagues from different parts of the globe joining us. So, as many of you would know, my name is Alec Frangi, and I'm professor at the University of Manchester. And I'd like to welcome you to the UK Centre of Excellence for In-Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation, or UK CEiRSI, as we call it for short, which is to our training webinar session, where this is a session that is proudly supported by Innovate UK, the Medical Research Council, or MRC, and with the sponsorship by the Medicines and Healthcare Products and Regulatory Agency, MHRA from the UK. And as the UK's first centre of its kind, we pioneered the use of in-silico methods to enhance regulatory science and innovation. And our webinars delve into the latest advancements, best practices, and applications of in-silico approaches. And we foster collaboration and interdisciplinary discussion with the idea of sharing between stakeholders and driving the progress in this area. We also want to challenge our way of thinking about these technologies to think that it's healthy. And this is partly what we're going to do today in this special edition, where I'm super thrilled and happy to bring to you a group of colleagues from very different backgrounds. So I'm not going to spoil the introductions from each of them. They will introduce them in a minute. But before we do so, we all have agreed to that I will share a few slides, 5 or 6 slides, to set the stage in terms of what is in-silico methods and what are some of the alternative approaches that we have to this. And after that, my colleagues will introduce themselves, and we will we will discuss a number of points that we have prepared that we think would be interesting to you. And there will be, at the end of the first hour, the opportunity for everybody to join in the discussion with questions, with comments, and we really would appreciate participation from the audience as well. So without further ado, so I'm gonna share my screen. So we call this webinar Digital Trials, Real Dilemmas, Philosophical Foundations of Evidence and Ethics in Computational Medicine. And I'm going to provide a very quick introduction to set the stage. I'm not going to get into the philosophical aspect, but just to explain a bit some concepts and context for the discussion. So in the development of medical products, whether these drugs or devices, there is traditionally 3 sources of evidence, scientific evidence, that we use to come to answer questions about the safety and efficacy of medical products. And this is through bench, animal experiments, and human testing or human trials. And I'm not going to go today in details about this, but there has been in previous webinars we have discussed at length some of the challenges of these different approaches and how the evidence that we have in the literature demonstrates that despite very refined methods that we have in each of these areas and the importance they have, there are sometimes situations where either they're not applicable or they have still challenges that they need to address. On the other side, we have what we call in-silico technologies, or more specifically in-silico testing. We can refer to preclinical phases or in clinical trials if we're thinking in the clinical context, which has as an objective to reduce the research, development, and regulation, ideally from years to months, and to improve safety by failing fast and failing earlier. And this is not seen as a replacement necessarily of all of the other sources, but more as a complementary source of evidence. Essentially, what these techniques are all about is about modeling, partly based on real-world data, partly based on information that we have in the literature, knowledge that we have, both aspects like the patients' populations, the influence of clinicians, sort of approaches to the treatment, the devices themselves, their interactions with the patients, and also modeling how some of the quantities that we can simulate that can be of physical, biochemical, or other type of natures can relate and translate into metrics of more clinical relevance, like, for instance, survival, comorbidities, complications, etc. And we tend to talk about in silico evidence to that evidence that is produced through this method. And these methods are fundamentally computer-based tests or trials that use detailed prediction models in highly controlled virtual conditions or virtual cohorts. And the idea is that by doing so, what we can do is at very early phases in the life cycle of our medical product, in very early phases, test it at the conditions that are typically of later stage studies. So we want to avoid having to go to later stage testing with the risk inherent to those for patients, and also the risk, economical risk for industry that are developing those technologies, and de-risk those by using these approaches at an earlier phase. So one possible way to look at the future is to fully replace current techniques with this method. That's not necessarily what we are proposing here. And another way is to say, well, actually, we have already 3 sources. What about if we use this 4th source and we look at when each of those can be of better use and applicability? And this is what most of our colleagues, myself, tend to be thinking that that's the way forward, so that we actually have a more proportionate risk-informed evidence framework that sort of builds on existing approaches and complements those. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of when we develop a model, there is a reality of interest that we're trying to explain or to understand. That could be the behavior, for instance, of a particular device. We develop some sort of conceptual model about that reality, and then this conceptual model that could be, for instance, a mathematical model, or it could be a sort of a behavioral model, or it could be any type of models, then has to be articulated into a computer model so that we can make simulations and we can compute that. And there are concepts that we're not going to go into a lot of detail today, but are important and distinct about model qualification, which is saying this model, does it represent the reality and all the reality, or does it leave some aspect uncovered? Model verification, which is my computer model reflecting that conceptual model? And model validation, which is my predictions, do they reflect behaviors of that reality that I'm interested in understanding? Now, in building one of these models, there is a central component, which is data. And the data itself needs to be valid, because otherwise we are informing perhaps very, very models that are qualified but are ill-informed in terms of the data that parameterizes them. So data is as important as some of these other technical aspects that we were talking about. So many times before this, I met many of the colleagues that are today with me in the call. I always was of the idea that maybe in-silico trials had to aspire to be as good as a randomized control trial, because in the pyramid of evidence, we tend to think about systematic reviews and random control trials as the gold standard of evidence. But that's something that is not necessarily a helpful way to think about it, and we will talk a bit more about this. It is important to understand rather where the in-silico trials fit within the wider pyramid of evidence and how it complements, and whether it isn't a pyramid in the first place. Just to explain why we mean that there are reasons to why there are other considerations as well, is that when we develop the randomized control trial, there is a number of assumptions we are making. One is that the sample of our population that we will expose to various treatments or interventions is representative of the wider population, that it is indeed possible to administer the treatments and the interventions to all the subjects, which may not be possible in some cases. So it might be impractical and unethical to do. But there is equipoise and exchangeability between the treatment groups so that we can swap them, and that this, from an ethical point of view, but also from a statistical point of view, are equivalent groups, which may not be always the case, or may not be possible to actually do that practically, even if that's what you want. Also, that there are no major interactions between outcomes and confounders, which again may not be the case. That you have a consistent way in which you measure the outcomes, so that you actually have a reliable system to sense and quantify the outcome, and you don't have noise at the very end. And many more things that we can bring, and that I'm sure will come out through these discussions. This is not intended to be exhaustive, just to explain why we have considerations to make here too. At the same time, there are situations where randomized controlled trials, might be the best way forward, and indeed, is in the top of the pyramid for a reason. And that's what, again, without going through this table, but in this last slide, I'm showing here a number of advantages, disadvantages of these techniques that we need to bear in mind. And one that I want to comment is that one of the disadvantages is that it's not possible to do a randomized controlled trial for every type of research questions that you have. There are situations where it's simply not possible or not practical or not ethical. And that makes that there are sometimes voids in the evidence, so gaps in the evidence that we will need to think about some other ways to fill them in. And I think that's all I wanted really to cover as a starting point. So hopefully that was helpful to give a bit of context. And now I would ask each of my colleagues to introduce themselves, and I will be calling them in the order that I have in my screen. So Nancy, would you like to go first? We cannot hear you, Nancy.
I thought I was unmuted. I'm so sorry. Anyway, I'm Nancy Cartwright, and I'm a philosopher of science, or more accurately, a methodologist. And I have a career-long interest in causal modeling and causal inference. And now, in the last decade and a half, I've been especially involved with evidence for causal claims, particular kind of causal claims, the ones that are to be used to evaluate social and health policy interventions. That's why I'm here, I guess. Now, as Alex pointed out, randomized controlled trials have been extolled as the most rigorous and objective way to establish causal claims for these purposes. And there is something to this claim for rigor. They're rigorous in the sense that internal validity is provable. So by that I mean that in an RCT that satisfies all the required assumptions, that's a big if it satisfies all the required assumptions, then it's provable that the experimental outcome is an unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect in the study population. I don't know, should I repeat that? It's provable that the experimental outcome is an unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect in the population studied. Now, I'm stressing the in-population study because that phrase is the troublemaker, okay? And it's a troublemaker for both material and in silico trials. Studies themselves can only provide results about the subject studied. But of course, we do the studies in order to figure out something about other subjects than exactly those individuals that were in the study. So then how do we use the study results to do that in any given case? And more importantly, what justifies that? Now, this is one way of expressing the familiar problem of external validity. And here, in my experience, rigor gives out way, way too much and way, way too soon. So we've got all this rigor in the first stage, doing a trial on a particular population. And then how do we use those results anywhere else? Very seldom do I see anything that looks rigorous, and often not very objective. So I think we really need to focus on this problem. That's why I'm bringing it up here. And we need to do so for both in silico and material RCTs. And part of the reason I'm bringing it up right here is because I think whatever is the case with respect to internal validity, in silico trials have one odd advantage that I hope we can explore. So, one simple way of doing external validity is just to take the results in your study population and apply them elsewhere. And Alex's idea that you take a random sample from the target population, I never see that happening. So how do we get to another population? Well, the thing is that for in silico trials, we know exactly what causally relevant features the virtual patients in the trial have. So we know what sort of guarantee what kind of a population the same results will hold in. And we know that because in silico trials, the patients have only the features we've assigned them, and nothing can play a role in the outcomes for these patients than the values of the quantities that are input into the equations in the model that's used to generate the outcomes. So we have a very clear and rigorously applicable description of other populations to which exactly the same results could be expected. And that's the kind of problem I'd like to explore. Both internal and external validity, and which aspects of it, which kind of trials have the are better at.
Thank you very much, Nancy. So I'm going to be mixing my colleagues from different backgrounds to do their introductions. I'm going to move next to Jeff.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Yes, so very different background. So I've been a part of several of these webinars so far. So some of you may be familiar with me already. I come in as a practitioner of in-silico methods in the orthopedic device industry for about 20 years. So I've worked with Zimmer Biomet for the duration. I've looked at all different types of total joint replacement systems, artificial hips and artificial knees and whatnot. Really through the lens of biomechanics and more specifically, how can we use simulation preclinically to support the design, development, clearance, and commercialization of those devices. So all along the way, when we are doing simulations in this space, we are thinking first as engineers, why do I believe the results, right? And the first thing is that we need to be convinced ourselves of the validity of the results we're doing based on how we want to use them. And once we have convinced ourselves, then we realize very quickly we have to convince many other people as well. So it's both internal people who may be outside of the immediate project team, but are still part of the internal decision process. Certainly, it's also external parties, regulatory authorities, clinicians who may be interested in adopting the technology, and the in-silico evidence may be part of the commercialization that they need to buy into. So that there quickly become a very wide spectrum of people with very different backgrounds who start to weigh in on, are these results believable or not? And so I've really learned to appreciate the importance of that question, the importance of being able to answer that effectively across a wide variety of constituents. So that's part of my background. The other part that I come in is for about the last 15 years, I've also been part of the ASME VVUQ 40 subcommittee. And as many of you know, in 2018, we published the first standard on how to look at credibility in a more systematic way for computational models, specifically being used to support medical devices. That was 6-7 years ago now. I think the use of that has really taken off. We've seen a lot of positive adoption of that. We've also come to terms with there's some limitations of it that we're trying to work on. And so I continue to be involved in that subcommittee, which is composed of people like me on the device side, people from software manufacturers, regulatory authorities, again, a very wide spectrum of people who are really interested in trying to come up with a more systematic, generally applicable framework so that we can all look at model credibility. We can all discuss model credibility in a fairly consistent way. So that's the second perspective that I come into this discussion with. And the third one that I want to highlight is, in the end, I'm just an engineer. I've been trained as an engineer. I'm a technical person. And I think what I find most compelling about this discussion here is the chance to interact with a handful of people that really we don't interact with day to day. So outside of the immediacy of simulation requests and studies that are going on and trials that are going on in my home office, take a step back and really think more generally, what is the proper position of in-silico trials relative to other sorts of evidence from folks who've really been thinking deeply about this for their careers. So really interested to hear this perspective. Really happy to be a part of the panel today.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to ask Pooja to introduce herself, but I need to say that if this event is happening, it's partly because of Pooja and I coming out from another seminar we did some months ago, and we both scratching our heads and said, I think we need to talk to some philosophers about this and ask for their input. So we finally made it. We organized it, but we are both very convinced this is really, really an important conversation. So Pooja, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Alex. So I'm Pooja Miles, and I work in the UK regulator of medical products, the MHRA. I head up the MHRA's Real World Data Research Service, and I support a lot of the regulatory science and regulatory policy initiatives. And one of the areas we've been really interested in is in silico trials and the question of is the evidence that is generated by in-silico approaches actually credible? Can we trust it? Now, one thing to say is that the MHRA is accepting in-silico evidence in some aspects. So like, especially in some preclinical aspects in areas like, for example, even just determining pediatric dosing, what is sensible before you even go into the testing phase. But what we're interested in is how far can we go with this? And one of the things that really interests me, and this is why I'm looking forward as much as all of you to learn from Nancy and Wendy, is how to respond to the skepticism and to the critics who say, well, how can you believe in evidence that is coming from simulation? It is not actually based on actual experimentation. So I hope by the end of the seminar, we'll have some sort of arguments to be able to counter that.
Thanks so much, Pooja. So there was an allusion to Wendy, and you could infer from that she's also a philosopher. So Wendy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. I'm Wendy Parker. I'm also a philosopher of science. I'm based at Virginia Tech in the US right now. My focus has been more on the simulation side than the RCT side in my work. So I'm interested in how computer simulation models should be evaluated and how they can provide evidence for claims about the real world. A couple of decades ago, philosophers had a lively debate about the relative merits of computer simulations and traditional experiments, not so much RCTs, but it would encompass RCTs. And one of the things that I want to emphasize today is that what I take to be one of the most important takeaways from that debate is just that while each of these types of methodology has some distinctive strengths and weaknesses, some of which Nancy was alluding to, and it's good to understand what those distinctive strengths and weaknesses are, we really need to evaluate the quality of studies individually and avoiding generalizations about one kind being better than another. So that's one thing I really want to emphasize. Now, how to evaluate computer simulations and computer simulation models is unfortunately far from straightforward, as Jeff has been, I guess, thinking about now in practice for a while. What I've been advocating in the philosophical context and to some extent in the climate modeling context where I have more experience is an approach to evaluation that really centers on the concept of adequacy for purpose, which is a way of thinking that I think is very familiar to engineers in general, but it has not always been central to the way that, say, theoretical natural scientists think about simulation. So, we almost always know that our computer model isn't going to perfectly represent whatever our real world target is, but okay, that's fine. That just means we don't want to evaluate our computer models like we evaluate scientific theories. We want to evaluate them like tools, right? What matters is whether we or whoever the users are can use the model along with whatever else we know to get a good enough answer to the question that interests us. So I've been trying to develop that framework, and I think that if we focus on adequacy for purpose, which really attends to context of use and users, this really makes a real difference to how we evaluate our models. It doesn't magically solve the problem of model evaluation, but I think it gives us a coherent kind of way of looking at what we're doing. So maybe we can talk a little about that today too. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And there is one thing I wanted to emphasize is that when Pooja and I had that conversation I alluded before, I went and I started Googling and I say, oh my God, there is loads of material from philosophers, and some of the titles of the papers look like if engineers would have written them. Like, things when you were talking about fit for purpose, is things that we were talking about, context of use and questions of interest, which is all about essentially doing that. And it's incredible to see so much resonance, and perhaps some aspects that people have looked into more the epistemics, others more look at the operationalization of some of those concepts. But both the good news is that they seem to be converging to some sort of consistent views as well there as well. So thanks a lot, Liz, and then Mark.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lies CEiRSI, full professor at the University of Liège in KU Leuven, working on biomechanics, computational tissue engineering. I'm also the executive director of the Virtual Physiological Human, which is an international society for in-silico medicine. I'm here to help Alex to ask questions. I'm not one of the the panelists or giving my opinion, but I would like to say that over the last decade, it has been really gratifying actually to see the change in the community on how they acquired a new vocabulary related to the verification, validation, uncertainty, quantification. And so I think now gradually people know words, and it is time really to go and have those conversations with people from other backgrounds to see what it actually means. I think 10 years ago, maybe a few people could have these conversations because the vocabulary wasn't there for most of the people. So it's very, very interesting to see that a lot of people are watching this and are ready to start thinking about this. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Perfect. Mark?
So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Mark Palmer. I'm the CTO for healthcare at ANSYS. I have somewhat of a sordid past. I started off as an MD PhD, learning how to treat one patient at a time, and then transitioned into a startup and then academia, spent about 10 years in the medical device industry before joining ANSYS. So along the way, I went from answering questions like, how do I treat the individual in front of me based on the information that I have about this person, to answering questions like, we're intending to do this procedure. Can you give us any information that would improve its success? Or I've done this procedure 5 times on these patients and it seems to be working. Can you help me understand why? To how do we actually assess how we are progressing with our knowledge? So more like modeling and simulation being the conscience of the experimentalist. And what I mean by that is we're conducting experiments to uncover cause or mechanism, and then using the model to try and capture the cause or mechanism that we think we have been uncovered, and using that in conjunction with kind of the statistical information about how well we did, or the correlation between our proposed mechanism and what we observed in the experiment, but actually baking that into a model that is accumulating all that knowledge from across experiments, so that we can actually quantify how well we can predict the thing that we're after. So the model becomes like this repository of knowledge. It becomes the accumulation of the experimental knowledge, and you're continually trying to close that gap to maximize your predictive power. This has posed for me ethical questions like, how far or how well does the model actually have to do to then replace those physical tests, especially if we're starting to do them if we're doing those tests on people? Have we accumulated enough knowledge? Do we have enough power? Where's the crossover point? Where's the ethical, have we reached the right level of predictive capability from an ethical perspective to be able to not have to test on people anymore? So this is what's kind of driven me back to being very interested in the feedback from this community and being very interested in the discussion that's going to take place today.
Excellent. So thanks a lot. So we have now a few questions. I want to sort of warn the listeners that some of the questions will be perhaps formulated in a way that teases discussion rather than necessarily expressing any position, and that all of us, we're going to be trying to do our best to contribute from our personal, perspectives, and we don't represent any institutional viewpoints in the conversation that we will have. Is a sort of candid conversation, trying to learn from each other and sort of tease out sometimes some of the views that we hear as well in our community, as much as the questions that we may have ourselves. Okay, so the first question that I like to put to the panel is building on something that was brought up already by Nancy a bit, which is if there are differences in the nature of the evidence that I provided from in-silico trials and other approaches, in particular looking at randomized controlled trials. And why we have this perception, some of us perhaps, maybe wrongly, that there is more, that one of those approaches is more credible than the other one. And I think this is about bringing as well some of the points that Wendy made, that maybe there isn't generic claims that we can make. It's more about contextualizing those claims. And maybe what we need to have is a bit of a general distrust to all of these approaches, and that human judgment cannot be eliminated from the analysis, right? So so I'll put it there. Nancy, would you like to sort of elaborate a bit more on that idea, and then anybody else who wants to jump in?
Yes. Well, I'd just like to point out that we often do have a lot of theoretical knowledge, and I've never understood why experiments of the kind of natural material RCTs are thought to trump a well-constructed, well-validated model. And the reason for that is the thing I mentioned, that those experiments, the RCTs, are always done on a population. And we then know the results for that population. And the point is that we want to use those results some way or another. We don't always have to export exactly the same average treatment effect. We use them some way or another on another population. And that cannot be done by methods alone. That's done by theoretical knowledge. So the idea that, we can trust experiments over theoretical knowledge, maybe because I'm coming at this from the social sciences more, and development economics, where it's very clear that RCTs conducted in Birmingham, Alabama, are not going to be very useful about predicting results in Birmingham, England. And I mean, I know that there's in the medical thing, well, lots of bodies are the same, but we know bodies aren't the same. And so what I'm puzzled by is, I think it's, again, like Wendy, it's case by case, but, do we have the right knowledge in this case to export the experimental results to this other population? How do we evaluate that knowledge that we're claiming to have that allows us to export the results in the way we want, and whether that is as informative as doing the in-silico trials, which have a lot of the theoretical knowledge up front, but you need less theoretical knowledge for some exports later on. Anyway, that's the kind of consideration I'm interested in. Like Wendy, I think you can't say these are better than those, or even on this issue, these are better than those, but they're likely to have an advantage on that, and just look case by case to see what do we actually know, what are we really happy to admit to, to take to be credible theoretical knowledge, because you always have to have the credible theoretical knowledge, and it just comes at different points if you're doing in-silico versus material RCTs.
Thank you.
And may I add to
Mark? Yeah.
Nancy's comment? So coming from the medical device side, and this is the engineer's view of the clinical trial, with that caveat, one of the things that we always try to do is to increase the signal to noise in a randomized control trial. So what do I mean by that? We want to take out any of the variability that would come from how the procedure is performed, where it was performed, like those types of things, so that you can actually see the effect of the proposed therapy. So we work with our key opinion leaders, the best in the business, the best surgeons operating out of the best institutions, all to minimize noise, and all to get the real repeatability in how the therapy was introduced to the patient. And then we also control the patient population, minimizing comorbidities or the things that would confound the effect that we're looking for when we construct that RCT. So what ends up happening is the results from the RCT gives you this very narrow, very tight response curve that you're looking for. But when the product goes into the wild, the behavior of the product is much broader, much more spread out. So I think this goes back to the questions that Nancy was raising, which is the extensibility of the results from an RCT to the general population that you intend to treat.
Can I just add something to that? I think you can even go so far as to say that in both cases, what you have is a model, right? In one case, you have a kind of material model. That's the subjects you actually do the treatment on. And in the simulation case, you have a mathematical or computational model. And in both cases, you're trying to infer from a model to something else. And it might be that the kind, what you want is for them to be similar enough in the relevant respects, and the way you probe that might be different, but it's not like you escape model-based reasoning in a way when you're doing the RCT. So that's even another way of putting Nancy's point about theoretical knowledge coming in.
That's a really important point. And sometimes when I show that slide with the 3 sources of evidence, I tend to ask to people when I give it to students, which of those you think is the gold standard, which you think is the truth, and which you think is a model. And they tend to think that randomized controlled trials or human testing more generally is the reality. But they are all 3 models, plus In-Silico is a different way. And perhaps there are elements, as Mark was saying, of transparency about your and disclosure of your assumptions, because you're coding them, so you're making them explicit, as opposed of other hypotheses that are more intrinsic to the methodology as a whole from a statistics point of view. Now, this also brings the point about the importance of communicating the results very well to the general public, in terms of that people understand the scope of the assertions you can make or the inference you can make. Pooja, I think sorry, you see you have your hand up.
I was just going to sort of, again, just add and reiterate some of the points already made, that there is no one method or one approach that is better than the others. It depends on the situation. It depends on the case. But there are clearly some areas, though, some advantages to in-silico approaches. Like, for example, even if we consider a randomized controlled trial that has been conducted really well, but we are trying to extrapolate from the findings in that population that was in that study to other populations. And there are often we find certain subgroups that are missing: pregnant women, very young children, the elderly, immunocompromised. You cannot also cover every single phenotype, etc., in these trials. So in that case, having an element where the in-silico approach allows you to model some of the intervention effects in these other populations would be quite useful. And I suspect one of the reasons why some people are skeptical is there might be this very naive misunderstanding that we're just making up data, that it's not based on anything which is like, which has substance. But that's not true. And I wonder, Alex, if there maybe you or Jeff or Mark might want to make some comments on how are these models built, so that to give people that assurance that there's this understanding, this knowledge which has accumulated sometimes over years of how a biological system works, or a mechanistic model, and then where we get the parameters to actually populate the model, to just give people the assurance it's not just making up stuff. It's even the models are based on a lot of evidence, so that the simulation results are actually plausible.
So I see that Nancy has her hands up. So what I'll do is I'll give a heads up to Mark and Jeff to answer Pooja's question, and suggest as well, Mark, that we and Jeff, that we explain a bit what do we mean when we say we build the models on real world evidence. And when that evidence may be on people, but not necessarily on the device or the drug we are testing, so that we don't conflate this with simulated trials, which is another story, right? Or real world evidence. Nancy, do you want to?
I just wanted to underline that you do need to stress more when people think this is made up, that these are theories you're using well known, that like the Navier-Stokes equations, which I've seen used in the aneurysm models. Those are heavily tested, zillions of different places. They've been applied across a wide variety of very, very different kinds of settings. We have a great deal of mastery of those. The theoretical knowledge is grounded in and supported by a huge amount of empirical knowledge. And moreover, it has lots of other virtues, that it's consistent with other bits of knowledge and so forth. So I think you'd also, in stressing how the models are validated, that they're validated by stuff that we really, really have a good handle on. Often, I mean,
Yeah, that's really important. Wendy, do you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, just really quickly, because I think this is a good point to bring in this point I wanted to make about, like, I think that the way when simulations do give us evidence, they give us a kind of derivative evidence, but if it's derived from things that are very solid in the ways that we've just been talking about, then that's great, right? So, I mean, I actually think that the way to think about, like, if a simulation result is evidence for something about a real system, it's actually evidence that we already had evidence for that claim. We just didn't recognize it as such because our brains are too limited, right? So, in other words, the Navier-Stokes equations, if we think that those are adequate for describing the system that we're looking at, there's a huge amount of information packed into those equations, which we are incapable of simply intuiting by looking at them. But if we solve the equations for a system to which we think they're applicable, really we're just kind of, we're teasing out their implications, but all that other empirical evidence that Nancy and others were describing that went into our believing that those equations are appropriate in the first place, that's all underwriting it. So I think that evidence from simulations is different from evidence from experiments in that it's a kind of derivative evidence, but it's evidence that we had evidence already. It's helping us to appreciate the import of the evidence that we already have when things go well with our simulations. So yeah, that's a more theoretical kind of perspective on it, but it's a way, I puzzled for a long time over, like, what is the character of this evidence that simulation provides? Because everybody seems to be assuming it's evidence when we're having debates about it, but everyone also has this intuition that it's not quite the same as, when I collect rain in my rain gauge and look at the height of it. And so how to understand that? So I think thinking of it as a kind of indirect or derivative evidence, or what some philosophers call higher order evidence, is a way of characterizing it accurately.
And what would be the point of spending all that money on the basic science if it weren't that the basic science was applicable?
Yeah, and the reality is that sometimes we are already relying on that basic science evidence in other domains. One example that always puzzles me is that we know that when we jump on any commercial airplane, there is 1 in 10 million chances of having an accident based on models and stuff that has been done. We still don't know what is the risk of having an accident if we participate in a randomized control trials, and we're using pretty much in many cases similar type of models. So one just to align a bit languages with nomenclature here, one way we call sometimes things is when we do models based on first principles, like the Navier-Stokes example, any other equations of physics or chemistry or biology, from where we do data-driven models, which are sort of not necessarily from first principles, but are from empirical evidence itself. Yeah, and I love, Wendy, your paper that I think summarizes a bit. There's the title of your paper that says virtually a measurement, right? That somehow summarizes what we were just discussing here, that many of the simulations are virtually a measurement if they come from those first higher order evidence or first principles. Maybe it's a good point here to give Mark and or Jeff the chance to explain a bit, dissect a bit, how do we build the model?
Yeah, so I'll speak to it now from the perspective of a software manufacturer, that our goal is to be able to accurately represent the causal or the mechanisms that are present across different styles of physics. So whether it's fluid dynamics, solid mechanics, electrophysiology, these principles that have been well explored, that have been reduced to equations, and those equations may occur at many different levels of organization. So from string theory all the way up to like a jet aircraft,
Ecology.
like Alex mentioned. Being able to capture those physics in tools that would allow the user to apply them to their system of interest. But the other thing that Wendy mentioned is that there's even in one equation, there's a lot of complexity in there that is hard to visualize or capture mentally. That gets even more confounded in complex systems where multiple physics are in play, and they're all interacting with each other, to a system like biology, which is a moving equilibrium through time. So this is incredibly hard to understand and to comprehend without models to help you visualize things that are hard to visualize, help you to probe questions in a very pointed way that's very hard to do experimentally. But again, it's anchored to these equations that have been well established, well accepted across the different disciplines. So I'll turn it over to Jeff to kind of link that to modeling reality.
Yeah. So to get into a little bit more the reality, when I think about the validation, I'll take a step back here and talk about whatever method it is, right? Whether it's simulation, whether it's a bench test, whether it's even a clinical study, right? What does it mean to be valid? It means we believe in the results, right? Fundamentally, that's what it is. And on what do we believe those results? A very common misconception, I think, is that I believe the results because they make sense to me. Right. So I do this simulation and it shows me this fluid flow, right? Or it shows me this mechanical response of the system. Or I do this benchtop test and I put the thing in the system and I test it in some way and the results jive with what my mechanical intuition says based on education and experience and things like that. That's not validation, right? That gives me a warm fuzzy, but it's not validation. Validation really means that we have a fundamental reference that we do consider to be the ground truth. My intuition is not ground truth. Ground truth is evidence that comes from some other source. And we're going to take a look not at the legitimacy of the inputs to the simulation, right? Not the legitimacy of the inputs to the test or the clinical study, right? Those can be legitimate, but substantiating the legitimacy of the inputs also isn't validation. It's really looking at what are the results from that method. And so with a simulation, right, we're taking a look at, within the medical device space where I play, is this hip stem going to loosen in a patient over time? Am I going to get a periprosthetic fracture, right? Am I going to have a dislocation of a joint because of the reconstruction? These are the outputs of the simulations that we're generally concerned with. And validation means I'm going to come up with some other data that I think is indicative of the likelihood of that. I'm going to make sure that my model predictions are consistent with that reality under those sorts of conditions. And if I believe it's consistent with reality under those sorts of conditions for which I have this other referent data set, then I can start to go outside of that and take a look at, well, what about in this scenario? What about in this scenario? What about this scenario? Knowing that I'm sort of anchored in that the validation space that I've lived in, where I do have a direct comparison of the outputs to, could be a benchtop experiment for the case of simulation. It could be clinical data in the case of medical devices, could be a wide variety of things, but that referent data set.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So, so to synthesize a bit, so we build these models, I would say, with a context of use in mind. So we're trying to answer a question. I think that's what Jeff is saying. That question is a starting point, but also the point where we double check, can I trust this model? Do I believe this model to answer that question? That speaks a bit as well to Wendy's point about the suitability or the fit for a particular context. We also need to, part of that is the judgment that is being made. And I bring in this point of human judgment on purpose, because I know Nancy had some comments about that as well, that we can't just escape that human judgment at some point, right? We are making us, we need to judge what is credible based on the knowledge we have today, on the disease, on the device, on the way that the materials behave, on the data we have access to, on the feasibility of doing or gathering additional experiments. So all of that puts us in a position where we create a model that tries to accommodate all of that. And then I suppose there is an element about transparency as well, where this has to be able to be double checked with a second, person or collective, and sort of, in a sense, there is an element of consensus. I remember that in the pyramid of evidence, the top is not an RCT, but is systematic. So it's consistency over something we perhaps need to remind ourselves here as well. So I want to start. I mean, time is flying, which is great, because it means we are having quite a good conversation. But I want to make sure that we cover some of the questions we have, and also start answering some of the questions that are coming from the team. So Alex Horsley, a colleague in Manchester who is into respiratory diseases, he was saying, what you say about RCTs is correct, but somehow, they're in the embedded technique in the system. They're recognized as the gold standard and with pretty good rigorous guidelines to enshrine this. In-Silico trials, and Alex uses the expression that Mark and I have talked in the past, are the new kid on the block. So somehow there is an excess of demands on it, right? It needs to overprove itself in a way. They don't have the wells of data experience, and they're man-made. So any errors may be biased. What do we need to do to overcome these barriers? I mean, what levels of evidence are enough, and how do we quantify or approve those? So anyone that wants to take that point? Wendy, you wanna go?
I can give it a try, a little bit. Yeah, so I mean, a couple different questions in there, like one of the concern about bias that came up, and I think that's an interesting one. And for that, I think one way to try to remedy the fact that we might have bias in the way things are constructed based on who's doing the constructing is to have a lot of perspectives involved and to have it checked by a lot of perspectives. I don't know that there's a whole bunch more that can be done than that. That's one strategy. But in terms of like I don't know about quantifying the evidence, but I think we can think about the sort of demandingness of our approach to having evidence. So, and this was alluded to a little bit already with Jeff, some of Jeff's remarks, like we can say, well, it fits, like we've done these simulations and they fit with what I expected. Okay, that's pretty weak, right? But we also might be in a situation where, and I'm not sure to what extent this happens with the sort of V&V approach that Jeff was describing, but we can have a mentality that says, like, what I'm doing when I'm evaluating my simulation model or simulation study is I'm accumulating support. I'm building confidence. It's a very positively oriented kind of mentality where you're looking for the support. Another way, which is also grounded in a different kind of philosophical approach to evidence, is a much more, pessimistic stress testing kind of approach, which says, okay, my job as an evaluator is to come up with tests that will reveal this model to be inadequate if it is. I'm gonna try to come up with tests such that if I can pass those tests, that's about as good as, that's I very likely would fail the tests if my model's not good enough, right? So you can, I think one way of maybe trying to help the new kid on the block is to say, well, we're not just trying to build confidence. We're not just trying to show you how great our model is. We sat down and thought to ourselves, what are the most demanding and rigorous tests that we could put this thing through that would reveal its limitations as best we can, and use those to draw conclusions about what we can and can't use it for. So that's my best kind of take on. It's obviously not as, I mean, you want your model to be good and succeed and work for your products and so on. But if we're specifically addressing this, like defending the new kid on the block, then I think having this kind of really demanding perspective might be a way to go.
And I wonder whether this is to some extent how we came to have confidence or trust in randomized controlled trials as well, because we do know they fail in some cases. We know that there are limitations, but nevertheless, we still believe that probably is about the best we can do or we could do so far given. No, so Nancy disagrees with that. Please explain me that, and then you're on mute, Nancy.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt then. I just didn't want that to go, eventually we need to, they are, I'm sorry, they are good for telling you about the population that's studied, honestly. And we, lots of us don't have that much confidence in them. Again, as I say, because I'm coming from the behavioral, social, and economic sciences, where they're just not very useful, right? Because they tell you about the population studied, and yeah, that's great. And you can do that rigorously, but that's, then you have to move beyond that and doing more randomized controlled trials, doing 6, 10, that's just induction by simple enumeration. And we know we don't get the same results anyway. So then we make up some kind of super population. Anyway, it's just that it may be that they have won to be thought of as the gold standard, but they don't deserve it. And I don't think, I think you probably, in being the new kid on the block, you can't start by saying they're not gold standard to begin with, but still we should keep in mind that the deficiencies they have, what they can and cannot do, and keep bringing that up when people talk about what you guys can and cannot do. That's all that I was want to fuss about. That's
very helpful.
Also,
yes, sorry, go.
Also, it's just that, the methods of validation and verification that I've seen you people using and that I've seen in ASME and the FDA, that's just standard stuff in validating measures in the social sciences. So I want to design a new poverty measure. And how do I know that it is, the numbers I'm getting out are the numbers that reflect reality? That's just basically the same kind of issue. And measures are defended by models. I mean, it's exactly the same. And yet none of that's kind of carried over into onto your side, that this is something that goes on all the time in the social sciences. They have exactly the same sort of a good validation process, does all the same stuff you're recommending, and people rely on these measures all the time. Now, I mean, that maybe they shouldn't, but some are better than others, but it's still the same process. So it's in part just because somehow RCTs have seized the high ground that it's harder to make credibility for other things which are done, get the credibility in quite different ways, like measures. Sorry.
Thank you. Pooja.
I just wanted to pick up on one of the things in Alex Horsley's question was, well, RCTs are embedded. And I would say I've actually come across these arguments before when we were looking at, can we use observational data, for example, and observational studies to emulate trial results? Can we use real-world data to complement or supplement some of the RCTs? In fact, the MHRA has got some draft guideline out right now, which is out for consultation, which is on the use of real world data as external control arms in the context of clinical trials. So I think there are still people who are, sort of who like to see themselves as methodological purists. I would call it more methodological orthodoxy, but there are certain situations where there has been a real practical or ethical need to look for new methods because the classical methods were not giving us something. And maybe, I think, Alex, so the point about, this is embedded, RCTs are embedded in practice, so we can't do anything about it. I think that's not true. And in fact, all the key regulators have been open to this idea of embracing new methodologies to address these challenges of how do we generate credible evidence when an RCT may not be most appropriate. And I wonder, Alex, if this is the right point to segue into some of those ethical challenges that come where the only alternative is to look at other things. Like, for example, like in oncology trials, would you really be randomizing people when, they've got a very short window of to live? Would you actually consider putting them, randomizing them to a placebo in that case? And that's why we have single arm trials. And that's why, you do consider external control arms as well. So Alex, over to you.
No, and there are many, there are many other examples where you cannot necessarily assume liquid voice, for instance, and you could, however, do those in a simulated environment as well, right? Jeff, you seem to have put your hand down. Is that?
I have some points, but if you wanted to get into the ethics discussion, then go with it. Otherwise, I have a couple more things around this one.
Okay, let's go through your points and then we'll move on to the ethics. What would be really helpful, Jess, if you could help me to answer the question we have at the moment from an anonymous attendee, because I think we probably could say that some of those things have been done or are being done at the moment. But I think it's a very good point, the one that is brought.
Yeah, so I have now a third thing to comment on. So the first one, in response to the question, can one go back, run simulations on already conducted trials and compare predictions with that? Yes. I mean, that is, in fact, I think a lot of what we are doing nowadays in practice, right? We're taking a look at the evidence that we already have on hand, and it's evidence that comes from registries, if the performance is captured in national or international registries. It's from clinical studies of all various types that have been published in the literature. It's based on post-market data that comes into individual manufacturers that only those manufacturers have a line of sight to. It's complaint data to regulatory authorities that we have access to. It's case studies of failure mechanisms. It's internal data. All that, there's so much data that are out there that if you're looking at it through a lens of, I want to have a simulation that is predictive of this, right? We look at all those different sources of data, and if we can convince ourselves that data are legitimate. So that was one of the things, Alex, I think you brought in earlier, was we have to trust the data if we're going to chase after it. But if we scrub the data and we think that it's legitimate, then yes, all those things are in place for sort of validating models using retrospective data, so that we potentially don't have to, do intentional prospective validation experiments. Now, in practice, typically in most cases, we are still doing something prospective because we find that we can piece together these things historically, but there probably are still some fundamental gaps that we need to address before we can convince ourselves of the adequacy. But certainly looking backwards can help to minimize that investment going forward.
And just to add to that, Jeff, there is also, at least I've been hearing this quite a bit, that in the area of in-silico methods, we probably need to start doing more what happens in regular trials, where they publish their protocols ahead of the execution, to also make sure that you freeze, your analysis and your parameters and everything. I'm not saying that people are necessarily not doing that per se, but just to add that extra level of transparency on that aspect. And perhaps I just want to mention this. I'm sure that Mark could explain that more, but I was a week or two ago in a meeting organized by ANSYS, where one of the partners from ANSYS that is working on the drug domain explained that actually they publish 3 or 4 days before the official publication of the trial their predictions with models, and it turns out it was actually quite consistent with the outcomes that came in the human trial 3 or 4 days later. So they actually play a gamble with that, because that could have gone the other way, but actually was an attempt to do that in a blind way, and not sort of fixing parameters because they didn't know the outcome. Jeff, I think you have some other items that you wanted to raise, and then we'll come back to Pooja's point about the ethics aspects.
Yeah, so one brief comment is, we've referenced gold standards quite a bit. My own perspective on this is that a gold standard oftentimes is an inertial standard, right? It's something that's been in place for a long time, but because it has history in the industry, it has history with regulators, it is deemed as the standard. But if we were to actually objectively look at it now, relative to other sorts of things, it may not be so golden. So I think history really is a relevant part that we have to get around somehow in a good way. So that's more a comment. And then one final question, and Wendy, this is eventually going to come back to you, so I'll put you on watch here. So you had talked about knowing the limitations of the model, right? Really pressure testing the model. And when I was hearing that, I was thinking back to when Mark was talking about how when we frame RCTs, typically we're really not pushing the boundaries there, right? Because we're trying to maximize the signal to noise ratio. So we're really trying to not necessarily understand the limitations of the device or the intervention. We're trying to do it in a very controlled way. So the limitations there are limitations on the model that you've talked about that we can't explore. Do you think finally that the limitations have to be known for whatever type of method we're using, whether it's an RCT, whether it's a simulation, whatever the case might be? Do we have to really pressure test the limitations? We have to identify those limitations in order to deem it adequate for a particular use?
Almost yes. I think what I'd say is the kind of perspective on evidence that I was describing applies to any kind of evidence, right? Whatever your source, if you really want good, strong evidence, then I think taking the mentality or the approach that says, my job here is to try to reveal the inadequacy of my tool, to check, to do my best to uncover any errors or inadequacies that are present that might affect the question that I'm trying to answer. So in that sense, yes. But the reason it's only almost yes is that I think sometimes we're not interested in that demanding level of evidence. Sometimes we just want to have something that's plausible, or we want something that's gonna, we don't necessarily, our purpose might be such that if we get it wrong, the stakes aren't very high, and we don't want to invest all that time doing that kind of stringent evaluation. But I think like when the stakes are high, then that kind of perspective applies no matter what your source of evidence is. And I think too often, and maybe this is true in RCTs too, but I was more worried about it when I first started thinking about simulation evaluation. I think too often, people love their models and they want their model to look good, and they highlight all the good things that their model does. And they show that it fit here and it fit there and it fit that. And don't think through carefully, like what the failures reveal about the limitations of its applicability. It's that building confidence kind of perspective, as opposed to, trying to reveal inadequacy perspective. Yeah.
Validation versus advocacy, right? For a model, in a way. And also, I was wondering, as you were explaining that, Wendy, isn't that the whole purpose of science in general? We have theories that we're trying to disprove to show their boundaries, in a sense, right?
Maybe different people have different perspectives on this. This would be a whole thing.
Another chapter. Mark.
Yeah, just to expand on that a bit. from the engineering side, we tried to build in these margins of safety. And one way to look at margins of safety is, are you operating at the edge of your theory, or are you kind of in the sweet middle spot where you're safe and you have some boundary of safety around you? That becomes much harder to define as the complexity of your space increases. So when you enter multi-physics domains or in AI, as you start expanding the number of parameters that are being input in your model, it becomes harder to define whether you're in a spot where you're data rich and you have a boundary around you, or if you've actually landed in a place in this complex space that is data poor or theory poor, due to all the complex interactions. So, I mean, that's something we have to watch out for, both in data-driven models as well as in engineering or causal models.
I totally agree. You know, a lot of my worries were motivated by climate modeling, which suffers from some of the same challenges of, you know, integrating lots and lots of different theories and sources and so on to try to build these mammoth systems models.
Okay, this is an exciting conversation, and I can see that we can go on and on and on. But I'm determined that we have at least half an hour for getting additional questions from the community. And I know we have a number of very sort of very relevant philosophers as well with us in the audience that I'm sure could contribute questions and comments. So what I'd like to do is focus one last area and for another 10, 15 minutes max, and then we will open it for general questions. And I'd like to focus a bit around questions around the ethics, given that we've been looking a bit more in terms of credibility so far. Would you like to introduce the topic, Pooja, and perhaps explain, you know, I think there are two things that I suggest to kick this off and introduce the topic. Perhaps if you could briefly explain, you know, what do we mean, what we mean equipoise, you know, why that's important, and the principles of beneficence and non-maleficence as well in the studies. And perhaps, and then second, if Mark, you could introduce the idea of why sometimes, you know, we might want to do additional studies that may require, you know, it would be improved with additional measurements, and we're not necessarily thinking about invasive or super invasive measurements, but things that are not necessarily part of the protocol, and how that is balanced, you know, the desire to improve the models versus, you know, the extra demand on patients that is involved. Is that a good point to
Thanks, Alex. So I want to just pick on three key ethical principles that do come into play in randomized controlled trials. So one is this concept of equipoise. Now, before we go to equipoise, the whole point of like why people say randomized controlled trials are so great, because you have randomization. So you randomly assign people to getting the treatment or the standard of care or a placebo, something like that. And the idea is that when you have true randomization, you account for known and unknown confounders. The issue is, of course, that there might be certain situations where there is uncertainty, genuine uncertainty in the medical community about the treatment effects, whether it presents a benefit, whether there would be some effectiveness, etc. And that creates this ethical dilemma. So if, for example, you are the principal investigator and you have to sort of like, and you've got a patient that you've just recruited or enrolled into a trial, and you have a very strong feeling that actually this treatment might help them, that creates an ethical dilemma for you. So there is this notion, of course, that, you know, that there should be this element of, I genuinely don't know, 50-50. So it is ethical to actually randomize the patient and then see what happens. There are, of course, nowadays people are talking about, you know, adaptive randomization as the trial progresses. If there are some indications and preliminary analyses that maybe the treatment is better, maybe you switch people to that treatment. But this equipoise principle is there. And this is why a lot of the oncology trials are single-arm trials, because it is considered unethical to withhold potentially life-saving treatment from cancer patients. But other two key principles, which are sort of related, are beneficence and non-maleficence. And I think in this case, one could argue in randomized controlled trials, because it's experimental, you can't guarantee a benefit, but at the very minimum, you should not be causing harm to the patient. This is a big concern. I mean, you can't rule that out completely, which is why there is very strict monitoring of safety outcomes in the clinical trial, but that's there. So there might be certain situations where you have real concerns about safety, and that is a reason why sometimes you do exclude very young children, pregnant women, often women in general, because you don't know how treatments would interact with their hormonal profile, with their fertility, reproductive capacity, etc., than the very elderly, immunocompromised people. So often there is an argument that let's not include them because there might be this potential harm which we can't rule out. So those were some of the indication, or some of those cases where you still need some evidence. You might still want to have some idea of how this treatment would then work out, affect these groups of people. And this is where some of the simulation evidence might help. I'm going to stop there and see if you want to pass on to someone else.
That's great. And that's perhaps in the treatment seems very clear that that compromise where that is not reasonable, where you cannot have any compromise. I think if I understood correctly, Mark, when we had a conversation with Mark about this point, it was that sometimes it's a bit more nuanced, because it's not necessarily about treatment, it's about extra burden on the patient, for instance, in the form of additional measurements or additional data points that might be sort of transcendental in terms of point of view, what the outcome will be for the patient, but it's just extra burden, patient burden. And I also want just to mention that deciding to put a patient in a human trial is in itself a large burden. And some colleagues from MHRA remind me that usually that's not a decision of do they go one day to a test or not. This is a 5 years engagement of them with a trial that has a lot of ethical implications as well. So we shouldn't be looking at this only in terms of adding extra burden by taking extra measurements to make an in-silico trial more accurate, but also in terms of saving the burden of participating in a human trial for someone. If we could save X number of patients from a study and get the same outcome, the same quality of evidence, would that become, from an ethical point of view, also advantageous? Anyway, probably, Mark, I didn't say that very well, and I'm sure you're going to correct all the things and put them right. But
no, I think you hit on the key question there, which is, it seems like one of our goals should be to be able to reduce the amount of human testing that we need to do moving forward. But it also seems like the price may be that for some patients that are involved in these studies, we may have to collect additional data in order to make the model better, so that we don't have to do that in the future. And that collection of additional data may introduce more risk to the patient. Any procedure, any imaging study, that next blood draw, whatever it may be, isn't zero risk. So the accumulation of those things to enrich our predictive capability, whether it's with a data model or with a causal model, introduces more risk to the patient. So how do we think about that from an ethical perspective?
And could you explain a bit, Mark, why sometimes we need this extra data? Because that may not be obvious to everybody. Why we need, is it the quality of the models is different if we base it on purely regular, sort of routinely collected data, that if we add some extra items, again, that may not necessarily be, we're not talking about doing things that are unethical from the point of view of basic measurements, but some additional data points that will either help to corroborate the quality of the model will make the model better informed about the characteristics of the patients. Can you expand a bit on that?
Um, the way I think about it is with examples like this. So we have things that are like the clinical standard of care, where we collect certain information about the patient in the process of managing them that helps inform how we're going to treat them and manage their health moving forward. If we deviate from that, then we're changing the standard of care. And one of the ways you could do that is like in a drug study, if we believe for some reason that additional biomarkers would inform the management of the patient, or understanding those biomarkers would help us make predictions about the course of that patient, then we're introducing a new blood draw, potentially to collect those biomarkers. If we believe that 3D imaging like CT or MRI may give us additional information over the standard of care, which is ultrasound, then for that study, we may want to do the CT or the MRI on that patient in addition to or instead of the ultrasound. So those changes are all changes to standard of care, and those changes may increase or reduce the risk profile for that individual. Most often, we're trying to increase the amount of information that we're getting, so it's going to increase the risk associated with collecting that information from the individual.
Perfect. So is anybody willing to add to this? I mean, maybe explore these elements about, what is the trade-off? And again, I don't think we are seeking here generic conclusions. I fear Wendy will confirm that most likely, like in the quality of the evidence, the ethical implications it needs to be assessed, on a per case basis. But at least I will try to explore some examples of situations like the ones, that Pooja explained for cancer, where we actually could have benefits in terms of, doing things in a computational way. I don't know, Mark, whether we could here cover a bit the published example of some of the studies that were done by some of the manufacturers where they had to look at heating profiles, for instance, in MR scanners and MR compatibility. And, that would be another example where there is no way you can do that on humans, and how, potentially that can be complemented maybe with animal experiments. Is there something that you would like to expand on that?
With respect to the MR safety or MR compatibility, one of the key ethical questions is if the device does not behave well in the patient, in the scanner, what is the risk to the patient? And for the devices that were in consideration when we were trying to work our way through the simulation aspect of this, it was devices for deep brain stimulation and devices for pacing or managing the electrical activity of the heart. So both of those were like considered the highest risk category. So addressing that in a randomized controlled trial was not ethical. So the work with the regulators at the time was to go through this process of doing what was called hierarchical validation of the simulation, which means that we start off validating the computational methods against bench tests, and then move to validating the computational methods against animal studies, and then making that lead to predicting what would happen in the human without actually putting the human in the scanner, to come up with what the predicted risk would be for harm to the patient. So that was how we tackled that question, and it was deemed important enough to pursue because MRI scans were such a significant part of how patient management was occurring. So after a patient gets this device, 30 to 50% of them somewhere along the way would need an MRI scan for some other condition.
So just to make absolutely sure that those who may not have the context position this example, imagine a new stent or a new pacemaker or a new Parkinson that you put on the brain. The things will hit, right? Will produce, effects that could or could not happen when you put that device in a scanner to do imaging, say 5 years down the line, because of a completely unrelated condition. Right? So that's what we're trying to look. These are safety concerns. So it's not about effectiveness necessarily, it's about side effects. Wendy.
Oh yeah, that seemed like a wonderful use for simulation. But it reminded me of a question I have just out of ignorance, which is, it would seem like another really good use would be just as a kind of screening tool, not for patients, but for ideas for devices or things that you have that, in the development phase, where you can like reveal that some things according to how you simulate them, are not going to work or are going to have problems. Is that something that goes on already? Is that a common use of simulation in this context? I'm imagining like I have an idea for a new kind of device, and I might be able to build up some model of it and see what the model predicts is going to happen in certain kinds of cases. And I might discover like, oh, it predicts something really bad is going to happen. So let's not pursue that. Let's think about what else we need to do or something different. Is that a common use for simulation in these contexts?
I can answer that one. I think that's very common. So in the spirit of, for innovation, right, you want to fail early and often. Simulation is one of the best ways to make that happen, right? So that's very early on. A lot of designs are killed. A lot of ideas are killed. A lot of ideas are also optimized during that time through simulation. And then at some point it enters into the formal verification validation phase. Yep, absolutely.
So just to give two examples of that, one is off-label use of devices. So you do the device for a particular label for a particular use, but then there are patients that are out of that label that have no alternative treatment. They're treated off-label, and you want to look at potential side effects outside of what they were. So there are publications doing that. There are publications like you put a device, say a stent, into a brain aneurysms, and there are side branches that you may or may not occlude in the process of trying to fix the aneurysm. So, there are situations where it has been seen that if you do that, you can produce an ischemic stroke, for instance, by trying to fix an hemorrhagic stroke. And that doesn't happen all the time. It happens when a certain set of conditions are given, and it turns out that maybe some of those conditions can be, in drug therapy as well, and having a combination therapy, which is another case study for in-silico trials that will be combinatoric otherwise, right? Mark, I think you.
Yeah, I was going to say that Jeff's experience is probably because he's on the leading end of the curve with respect to innovation and modeling in healthcare. But I'd say it's highly varied, that there are still many products that are evaluated bench test and animal testing first without any simulation in the mix. So I think there's a spectrum out there. I also wanted to add to what Alex was saying, that frequently when the product is first introduced to the market, there's a definition around how it can be used and under what circumstances it can be used, the indications for use. That's very narrowly defined when the product is first introduced, and then the goal is to increase the indications, so increase the number of patients or types of patients that can be treated with that therapy. And frequently or increasingly, simulation has been used for those purposes as well.
Okay, so now before I go and try to start addressing one of the questions that we have by N. Gibson on the chat, I'd like to remind everybody that this is your opportunity now in the remaining of the session to put forward questions or additional items that you would like to comment upon. If technology allows us, I'm very happy as well that if anybody would rather sort of make a viva voce sort of intervention rather than typing it, if that's helpful, would be great. And then I'm actually delighted that we have both other colleagues from social sciences, from technology, and also I've spotted at least one member of the public, which is great. So going to the question, is agree around the gold standards being historically established and that RCTs are not always appropriate or possible, particularly with medical devices. Real world evidence, single arm, maybe more quality of it. We work in rare diseases and global health areas where there may not always be well-established data. I wonder if you could speak to the potential and challenges for in-silico trials in these areas. This is a really good question. Is the reality that there is insufficient data, or is this very dependent on areas, for instance, conditions such as have much more established data, or is the opportunity for in-silico here already? And I suppose a follow-on, if there is insufficient data, what data should be collected to facilitate in-silico tests? And I love that last question because I think that's probably an important direction of travel. And just for those of you who are not in the UK, and in the UK there is fortunately a lot of effort being done in developing the UK Biobank, like our Future Health, others. Thank you, cystic fibrosis. That are starting to create the type and extent of data that is needed. But I must admit they're not developed necessarily thinking in silico trials. They're thinking in that what we collect otherwise is very limited. And I have experience of having talked to colleagues from industry who were delighted to see results that we, for example, to give us data from studies, and then they found out that the data that they have as manufacturers is only a fraction of the data was actually ever collected, because most of the randomized controlled trials end up going to some core lab, does some spreadsheet of measurements on sophisticated data items, and then the data somehow gets lost or is somehow there for audits, but is not really accessible in ways that you can really exploit. And I think there is another question of ethics there, whether we can continue to do that and spend the money that we're spending in those studies. It's like buying a banana and sort of eating the peel and throwing the banana itself, right? What we are doing with a lot of the data sets. Anyway, just to be a bit tease out some discussions. So, Mark, you want to contribute to that question?
Yeah, I think an emerging area that will play an increasingly important role is this idea of disease progression modeling. So, understanding with a causal or mechanistic model or even a data model how this thing that we're going to try and treat will progress in the patient untreated, and then see whether you can develop the right therapies to slow that response, mitigate, or ultimately cure the disease in question. And an example of this, a community that's been working on this for a long time, is the cancer community. So how do tumors grow? How do they metastasize? And being able to capture a model of that untreated tumor, because as Pooja was mentioning before, it's unethical to to withhold treatment from a patient in a situation like that. So if you can model the progression of that particular disease, that particular tumor, and then look at whether you're going to treat it with radiation, whether you're going to treat it with a drug or a combination of drugs or a combination of radiation and other therapies, and how that affects the growth of that tumor, and whether you will be able to observe the arrest of growth or observe the shrinking of that tumor over time. That's kind of the power that the disease progression model will bring to the equation. And that's what people are looking at for many types of diseases, where it will complement or augment the information that you may get from a clinical study.
So in a sense, this move to in silico trials would also help to have to stimulate the deepening into the mechanistic understanding of disease and having much more richer data sets and design the data sets, the systems in the healthcare system, the data sets that we use in the healthcare data system, also with a view to improve that mechanistic understanding and not purely in a very operational way.
Yeah.
I think Lara would put in a moment the link that I passed about the new National Health Data Service that is going to be invested in the UK, which I think is going to be potentially a unique resource for many of the things that we're talking about. Because if many of these conditions that our colleague that made the question were referring to, they're rare. If you accumulate at the national level, they still remain being rare, but they're at least a bit more regular, or they're going to be more in your data sets than if you only think about, a human trial of 1,000 patients, right? So it's by having that breadth that we can start looking at that. I think partly the answer to your question, to the question, is that I don't think it's possible with zero data to do predictions. But what you can is, with sort of a certain quality of data, start to understand the implications of what additional data sets you might want to acquire to improve your ability to predictions, and somehow that driving some of the requirements for future database science. And some of us have been banging quite a bit to government of the importance of looking into multimodality of data for these new resources that are being built, that are really richer sets than pure sort of primary care data or secondary care data, with all the benefits that brings, and that we've exploited already so far. Other colleagues that want to contribute to the question or additional questions that members of the community may have.
I can give a little bit of a story here. So when I heard that question, so again, given my background, I'm not in the cancer space, but there are a small number of patients who do have cancer who end up needing some sort of replacement orthopedic device. And that's where the devices that my company makes would come into play. And pretty frequently, those are not, there's nothing standard about those, right? So these are typically humanitarian devices where there's a very specific patient who has a very specific anatomy and a very specific disease state that is needing some sort of MSK solution. And they need it now, right? We can't spend a typical medical device development process to get this to the clinic in a month or 2 or 3. Simulation absolutely ought to play a lead role there. Then it comes back to the question of, is the simulation adequate, right? Do we believe it? Yes, we can simulate these sorts of things, but what gives us confidence to believe in that, given that this is super rare because we've never addressed this patient before, and we're coming up with a very unique solution for this patient. And that's where I think we can look at the idea of tiered validation that was brought up earlier. We typically do not come into any of these cases with no information, right? With no intelligence about how things perform. We understand generally how, for more standard patients, right, we understand failure modes. In many cases, we have causal understanding of what leads to those failure modes. We have already some amount of either benchtop validation or clinical validation for those assessments. And those all give us confidence, right, that we have some understanding of the physics, of the physiology of these sorts of things. And even though for this particular patient, we're going a little bit afield of where we've been before, nevertheless, we're starting from a position of strength, and we can have that conversation internally, externally, around the credibility of the simulations. I think there's a huge opportunity because in terms of providing the solution to the patient, there really is no other way to do it in those sorts of cases.
Super. So Lara confirms me that is the possibility for any of you to request to speak, and therefore can bring you to the forefront so you can talk as opposed to having to make your questions. And we have, so there's 2 questions. We'll try to address these 2 and probably round up here. So there is one of the questions by an anonymous attendee: what role do you think patients and the public should play in shaping the governance of in-silico trials, particularly decisions about which data are used, how models are validated, and how transparent their assumptions should be, in light of initiatives like the NHS apps, which increasingly involves people in managing their own health data? How might we build more participatory models of trust and oversight in digital evidence generation? And this is super important point, and something that a few of us are very keen on, well, probably all of us, but definitely we've been considering this. So I'm going to open this to Pooja and Wendy. I know we have members of the public, of our public group in the audience, so I'm not going to put anyone in the spot, but if they want to contribute to answer this question, I would be more than happy to give them the opportunity to do so in one way or another. So Pooja.
So, Alex, in one sense, at the broadest sense, I think it makes sense to involve patient and public representatives when you're looking at broad guidelines or a principles-based approach to what does good look like. And I think at that level, definitely, it is good to have patient public reps, because it's important for us to give them the assurance that what's being done is done in a sensible way. There are sensible assurance mechanisms in place. Whether they need to be there with looking at every decision is a different matter. And it'll be interesting to see what Wendy and Nancy feel in terms of how do we provide that public assurance and credibility. I know that, Alex, you're also doing quite a lot of work on the patient public engagement, so maybe you'd like to comment on that as well. But definitely at a high level, I think what would it be needed to give patients the assurance that we have adequate mechanisms in place for evaluation and assessing the evidence would be important.
So Wendy, do you want to chip in first? Then I'm happy to.
Sure, mine's really short. I agree with what was just said. I would just add that it seems like it could be interesting to also have questions that ask public and the patients, like, what are the sorts of things for which they would be comfortable having digital evidence involved? Like, there's a risk, because if the perception of digital evidence is that, it's never trustworthy or something, then that's going to be a problem. But it might be that there are ways of understanding that, like, there are certain kinds of procedures or actions or other things that are much more comfortable for people to accept that there is an important role for digital evidence. It's not going to be separate from all the things that were just described about trustworthiness and appropriate and all that stuff, but it seems like there could be another kind of input that talks about the kinds of situations in which it's appropriate or something.
Yeah, and just to give an example of how important this is, we had in another seminar, one of the members of the public making a contribution that made all of those in the panel think about a use case that we never thought of, which was, can we use In-Silico trials to give them a sense of risk for them participating in the human trial? And because, yeah, and so just for those of you who are not directly involved in the CEiRSI, the Center of Excellence has a whole working group working on patient risk and trust, if we call it, where we have a group of patient representatives. We're trying to design a bit the areas of engagement, because what we want to avoid is that we spend lots of time into areas that already are well discussed in the context of general AI, or other areas where, or AI in healthcare, because there is a lot of elements about data aspects that are very similar. But we also want to address other questions, like, for instance, how people will react to if the label of their product would say this has been partially validated in silico, right? What sort of reassurance they will want to have there. And one of the things that has come from a lot of the work that we've done so far is that we all want to be, patients to be involved, and patients want to be involved as well, and members of the public. But it's also about giving them agency to have meaningful contributions, for them to have the level of understanding of the technology to empower them to actually make contributions that really make a difference as well for, and that they feel they understand, sort of what are they consenting or agreeing or suggesting in each of those. So there's a piece as well that we need to do in terms of training material and bringing things and concepts at the level that are co-created with patients, but are relevant for patients and members of the public as well. And that's something we're working on. So I think I'm going to have to speed up a bit because there's a lot of interesting questions and I want to make sure that we try to deal with them. That's a very important one. And again, if someone in the team would like, in the group would like to speak to that. I'm going to, there's another question. There's a question by Letao about disease progression models are very important both for virtual patients and also base analysis. But in reality, I found quite little published papers on DPMs, especially for rare disease, less explored diseases. This situation, which lack data, lack disease mechanism knowledge, could we still build plausible virtual patients on in-silico trials? I think, Letao, that is, I think there is a fundamental need data to create models of some sort, right? And maybe not data of the performance of a therapy, but at least of the phenotype of the subjects that you're trying to study. And I think we talked earlier on in the conversation about first models based on first principles and data-driven models. Okay, in reality, you never have all the understanding to have purely mechanistic models or all the data to have purely data-driven models of high quality. So there are like top-downs and bottom-up models, and I tend to say most of the times we are operating middle out, right? So you're somewhere in the middle, and you have to make connections with the principles and with the data. So my intuition is that when you have less knowledge, and what you need to do is at least build high-quality data sets so that you can have at least data-driven models in the first place to characterize the patients. But yeah, that's a sort of intuition based on what we've been doing so far. There is a question by two colleagues. One from, and it's great to have John and Rodri with us. So John joins from Manchester as well. He's also a philosopher, and Rodri is joining us from Edinburgh. So John is saying, one might think that ISTs, and by the way, if you would rather sort of want to chip in and contribute by explaining your question, John, I'll see whether perhaps Lara can make you and Rodri both able to speak. But I will read the question meanwhile and maybe want to qualify that. So one might think that ISTs are more informative than animal trials because the mechanisms are clearer in the in-silico models and because they are validated on human data. Would the panelists agree? If so, doesn't that reduce the ethical permissibility of animal studies? Absolutely. And I would say, some people ask me, why don't we do a virtual rat or a virtual, because why would you do a model of a model in the first place, right? So if we can model the real thing, why you would model something which is a surrogate? Because ultimately that's what an animal model is a model of a human of some sort, right? And you've seen that there has been developments in the US and recently as well in the parliament in the UK about the importance of reducing animal testing, not only for welfare issues, but also for the fact that they're, to some extent, there is evidence that they're also not very accurate. But I don't know, is there anything you would like to add to that, John, if you're able to?
Yeah, just thanks. Just to say, I guess then, so you might consider there's two uses for in-silico trials. One is in the kind of exploratory phase of the device, and the other is to inform regulation. And I guess there's no real dispute that in-silico trials are going to be really helpful in the exploratory phase. It's perhaps a bit more controversial whether they should be used in the regulatory phase. But it looks then as if they are going to be used more widely in the exploratory phase, then they create sort of ethical doubts for the use of animal studies, but also relating to this equipoise question. They reduce equipoise if you're getting good results from in silico studies, so there's less justification for RCTs in humans as well. So it looks kind of more or less inevitable that they're going to have to inform the regulatory phase, I would say, just on ethical grounds, if, as much as anything else. I don't know if people would agree with that.
Yeah, I think you're getting a nod from everybody, John. and I think as you develop high quality models, you also solve another problem, which is creating a continuous of evidence from discovery all the way to post-market analysis, which is the other question we had earlier about using data a posteriori to reconfirm your predictions, right? Because at the moment we have this fragmentation in the evidence production where we have like handover points, and if you actually look at a lot of the statistics about trials, some of these handover points are where we have the largest failure rates. You know, when you go to phase 1 to 2, phase 2 to 3. Mark, I think you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that I agree with that, but there is still the important role that animal studies play, which is to help with the kind of burning down the unknown unknowns, and also to give us more confidence about safety before entering a human study. So I think we need to give some thought about how what other avenues we have to address those two key things as we think about how to phase out or phase down animal studies and be more focused on how the human system functions.
So before I go to Rodri's question, and thanks, John, for the inputs, and I'm very keen to have a follow-up session to this one with colleagues like John and Rodri as well, to explore aspects of some of the, you know, the approaches that are being put in the literature about how you deal with the pluralism of evidence sources, and this addresses a question that actually Mark was sending me privately as well. You know, we talk about ethical and operational strengths and weaknesses of RCTs and ICTs. Is there an objective and ethical way to combine weight of the combined usage of these techniques? Is there an ethical imperative to address this? And I think this is about this. I think the ethical imperative is we can fragment evidence. I think something tells me from intuition that if you have multiple sources to come to the truth and you treat them as silos, you're not getting the best out of all of them when you actually sort of combine them. I think that's, if I understand correctly, this is the essence of John's sort of perspective of the evidential pluralism. And I'm not going to advance some of the discussions that we're having with John, but because we'll have other forums to present some of those discussions. But I think I would say that a lot of the work that the engineering community has done with us in EMB40 perhaps has prepared a lot of the ground in that direction. So just to finalize, I don't want to stop without giving the chance to Rodri to put his question, which I think is quite interesting. So he says, look, we are using modeling and simulation all over the place in other sectors that are highly regulated, you know, finance, insurance, health economics, aerospace, I'm adding, right, where we are relying day in, day out. And what is the special of medicine? Why we're not doing this? And that reaction, Rodri, was exactly the reaction I got in my first meeting with the members of the public when I explained them roughly what in-silico trials are. They looked at me saying, "So what's the question, right? Like, why we're not doing this?" And is I think a lot of cultural elements, but maybe some others want to add to that as well.
I mean, I think nice to meet you all. Yeah, no, I as I was listening to you all talking, so I'm a kind of sociologist slash philosopher, I suppose, of science. But in another life, I was a risk manager in finance, and so it just struck me of how much language from risk have actually been brought up, unknown unknowns, uncertainty, risk, and that these different places of regulation adopt very different languages of risk, which might be quite interesting to kind of explore at some point, because what evidence you need or what evidence means is often interpreted within that framework of what risks are permissible and which aren't. And yeah, so I thought that was an interesting kind of observation of mine.
Absolutely, and I assume that ultimately is the perception of risk what has made the cultural difference to a large extent, and this is embedded into the standards. Is what is the risk profile? It's interesting because even if you go to the UK government, let alone other governments, there is a document from 2013 that is called the Aqua Book, or Quality Assurance of Government Analytical Models. It actually talks about a number of principles. If you were and go and read that, and I'll put as well the link in the chat so people can look at their leisure. But it actually, so if Lara can make sure it goes to everyone, that document, if you look at the principles that they establish, is not for healthcare that policy applies for finances, and it's how policies are making in the decision-making policies are making in the government. They're actually using the same principles of many of the things we're talking about. So I think and this is why we're doing these webinars. Part of this is about socializing the ideas, making sure that we absorb them, we understand them, we sort of discuss them, we look at this from different perspectives, and we sort of collectively grow and learn. How much trust we already have in these models anyway, in other areas, and challenge why what would be a reasonable use in healthcare as well. Okay, I want to make a big thanks and a virtual applause to both the panelists and everybody who has been putting. I need to say I'm super proud. This has been the webinar probably with the largest amount of questions. We had 10 questions at least. It was really helpful. And I invite you to connect to our community. Lara put some of the links. We will continue to do events. And also, if you feel that there are perspectives that we are not covering in our series, you have access to all of the previous webinars in our YouTube channel. And this will go to the YouTube channel at some point as well in the coming weeks after is reviewed by and curated by the team. I welcome that you let us know additional areas that you would like us to cover. We are really taking the pulse from the community as well as to how we drive the conversation forward. So thanks a lot, Nancy, Wendy, Mark, Jeff, Pooja, and also Lisa had to go a bit earlier. Thanks for all of your contributions. Thanks to everybody that put questions, and also Rodri and John for their last interventions. And well, we keep in touch and have a great rest of the day.